Hey guys, welcome back to How to Roll Dice. I'm Josh, and today I just wanted to do a quick video talking about board game complexity, or as it's called on BoardGameGeek.com, weight. Has to do with the complexity or the crunchiness or the challenge of learning and playing a game. I want to talk about how that's a bit of a don't judge a book by its cover, or in this case, don't judge a board game by its box or its rulebook or its components, because oftentimes they can sort of present themselves as far more challenging than they actually are, and you end up putting it off and missing out on playing or owning a great game. In my case, I recently mentioned how I just finally played A Feast for Odin and Dinosaur Island, two games that I've owned for, I want to say, about a year, maybe, that seemed so challenging and daunting and intimidating that I just didn't even want to bother trying. And when I finally bothered to watch a couple of videos on how to play them, because the rule books were kind of hefty, and then sit down and play them with friends, it turns out they're not any more complex than most of the other games that I enjoy, and I did end up enjoying them quite a bit, and I plan on playing a lot more of them. And I knew that they weren't rated that high. If I looked them up on BoardGameGeek.com, and I had, they're only rated about a 3.7, 3.8, and I've played games all the way up to 4, 4.1, 4.2. So I knew they were well within my comfort level as far as complexity goes. They just appeared so challenging, and I let that sort of overwhelm my better senses. And you shouldn't do that. That's something that can happen to anybody, but especially will happen with beginners in this hobby, because some games do appear to be quite a lot. And then when you actually sit down and play them, they're not. It's just sort of a lot of pieces or a lot of moving parts or a really big board or something like that. But it actually plays pretty smooth and pretty straightforward. So first off, let's take a look at these three games here, right? These are three games that look more or less the same when you lay them out on a table, but they have a pretty gradual scale of increasing complexity. So this is the Red Cathedral. This is a great game that's rated around 2.75. It has to do with you playing as an architect, you and the other players playing as architects, attempting to assemble the Red Cathedral for Tsar Ivan the Terrible. And the game has resource management. It has sort of a small engine building mechanic with your ability to manipulate how you collect resources, which has to do with moving dice around on this sort of resource wheel. And the main goal of the game is to actually assemble and complete segments of the cathedral, but you can also sort of implant additional features into other segments of the cathedral in order to throw your hat in the ring for victory point scoring on that segment of the cathedral. It's not a super complex system. It's a very unique system. It's a really nice sort of compact size game when you lay it out on the table. And it's a 2.75, which is right around the middle of the 0 to 5 weight rating system. So it's a good sort of entry-level average of a board game. Then you could move up to something like the Castles of Burgundy. As far as the way the board looks when you lay it out, or the size of the game, the sort of style look of the game, it's similar, but when you look at the components, all of a sudden it seems like we've gotten way more complex. We've got these player boards with hex grids on them of hex shapes. You're going to be collecting and purchasing different hex tiles and placing them onto this grid to expand your noble kingdom. There are rules about how you place the tiles. You want to put certain livestock with other types of similar livestock to gain a points multiplier when you're scoring victory points. You want to build your shipping spaces, but you can only build those once you've connected to them using other hex tiles. You want to place different buildings on your board, but you can only have a certain number of buildings in a given segment. There's all kinds of rules, and when you look at it, it seems very daunting and terrifying. You're working with these different marketplaces and market tiles, and you're collecting gold to go to the black market to buy the rarer tiles. But in the end, the game actually plays almost the same as far as challenge goes as the Red Cathedral. The Red Cathedral is a 2.75. This game is about a 3. So it's only a quarter of a point higher. So as far as complexity goes, it's not very different. It just appears different at a glance. Then you've got a game here like Troyes. Troyes, at first glance, would seem similar or maybe even slightly easier to Castles of Burgundy. This is a solid game that has worker placement, that has resource management, that has engine building to it, and a bunch of, again, unique features to this game. And although looking at the back of the game, it might seem like it's actually a step down in complexity from something like Castles of Burgundy, because you've got more familiar pieces. You've got meeples. We know what meeples are. They're workers. You've got some cards. Okay. You've got some familiar pictograms, right? There's no crazy grid of tokens that you need to place and manipulate and sort of lay out in the perfect pattern. But this game is actually about a 3.5. So that's a whole half a point above Castles of Burgundy and almost a whole point above the Red Cathedral. So this is actually the most complex game out of the three, even though you wouldn't think it having looked at them. Then moving on to two games that look extremely different, but actually play very, very similar. These two games by Uwe Rosenberg. We've got Caverna, very popular game. He's a very popular designer, if you don't know. This game is a lovely little game about a family of dwarves living at the mouth of a cave who are trying to farm their pastures and raise livestock and develop different furnishings and rooms inside of their little cave home. This game is I want to say about a 3.7, 3.75. It's got tile placement, it's got worker placement for taking different actions, it's got some engine building with the way that your different sort of cave tiles manipulate the types of livestock you can have and how they breed, and victory point bonuses that you get at the end of the game. You can grow your family of dwarves so that you have more than 2 dwarves, which is what you start with, and that way you can take more actions during a phase or during a year. It's a pretty straightforward game, but it is a little bit more complex simply because of the number of actions that you can take, or at least that's what I think sort of lends itself to being slightly more complex, because there's more intricacy and there's a larger number of synergies that you can work with. This game is rated about a 3.7. So again, slightly higher than Troy's, but only by a bit, Troy's being about 3.5. So we're gradually scaling up here from Red Cathedral at 2.75, Castles of Burgundy at 3, Troy's at 3.5, Caverna at about 3.75. If I were to show you a Feast for Odin, also an Uwe Rosenberg game that I've talked about quite a bit recently because it's a great game, if I were to show you this next to Caverna, you would immediately think that this was by far an extremely complex game compared to Caverna. This looks like a rabid lion, tearing apart a gazelle next to a kitten playing with like a loose ball of yarn. That's how drastically different the two games look. This game has this massive array of something like 40 different actions that you can take right off of the bat, a player board that has this wild-looking matrix of squares and symbols on it, a bunch of other pieces and tokens that you can collect. You can expand your player board by adding multiple grids to that massive grid that you already have. There's different shaped and colored tiles, everything from rectangles to odd puzzle piece looking shapes, and then you've also got resources like wood and ore and stone. It looks like absolute chaos, but in reality, this and Caverna are basically the exact same complexity. I want to say Caverna is something like a 3.7, and A Feast for Odin is something like a 3.8. As far as how difficult they are to learn and play, they're almost identical. But if you were to see them laid out on a table, you would not in any world imagine that they played anywhere near each other. It literally looks like a children's game next to something that you would torture your average person with. But in fact, they play very, very similar as far as complexity goes. Then moving on to 2 games again, just to give you an example. These 2 games, both sci-fi, space exploration, space expansion style board games. We've got Eclipse. Oh, I'm dinging my mic here. We've got Eclipse and we've got Gaia Project. Eclipse came out in 2011, Gaia Project in 2017. They both have you expanding across an ever-growing grid of hex-based planet tiles and exploring those different planets, developing ships and sort of building on some special abilities. But if I were to, again, set these up on a table, you would look at Eclipse and you would look at Gaia Project, and they both look like they're a little complex, but you would definitely think Eclipse was the more complex game. You've got individual fleets of ships that each player is controlling. Each player is playing an asymmetrical faction. You're controlling the different resources and sort of income that you have to build ships and learn science or study science with, to expand across the galaxy. You're bumping into alien species and going into space battles and also battling other players. You're trying to conquer this sort of massive space station hovering at the center of the galaxy. You can go wander off on your own and try to live your own life, or you can just bang into other players and be in constant conflict. The stacks of tiles and upgrades and things that you can build into your ships, the fact that you can individually upgrade and sort of maintain the layout of every single ship in your fleet. Fighters different from interceptors, different from destroyers. It's an extremely complex sounding system, but in reality, it's only a 3.7. It's actually easier to play than A Feast for Odin. It's basically the same as the last 2 games that I've discussed as far as complexity goes, but you would never think that looking at the game as far as how it's laid out and the sort of presence on the table. Now, Gaia Project looks equally complex. I would say actually slightly less complex. You've got a player board, you've got asymmetrical races, you've got some lovely tokens, you've got a grid of hexagonal planetary tiles, but it doesn't seem as complex because you're not managing ships and you're not managing science and studies and upgrades, and you're not managing the layout of your ships with different weapons systems and engines and shields. All of that is in Eclipse. Looking at the 2, you would go, Eclipse has to be more complex, right? This is a 3.7, as I mentioned. This is a 4.4. This is the most complex board game I own, and I want to say it's probably top 10 most challenging board games of all time as far as BoardGameGeek.com is concerned. I want to say the highest rated weight on any game right now is 4.6, 4.65, and that's On Mars, which I believe released in 2020. I've never played it. I don't own a copy. I've never seen a copy. But this is a 4.4 compared to a 3.7, and again, if I put these on the table next to each other, you would be certain that this was the more complex game, and this one is by a lot. Similarly to how you would look at A Feast for Odin and Caverna and think A Feast for Odin has to be leagues more challenging than Caverna, and they're identical as far as complexity goes. So you really can't judge the complexity of a game based off of how it looks, not even just the box, but even once the game is laid out on the table or you've read through the rule book. You really need to play the game to get a feel for how complex it is. There might be a learning curve to reading through the rule book if the rule book isn't particularly well laid out, but you can always watch a tutorial video on how to play the game, how to learn the game. But yeah, you really need to play through a game to get a feel for how challenging it is and to get a feel for whether or not that level of complexity is too much for you or it's going to take away from your enjoyment of the game. I don't think I've ever played a game where the complexity level took away from my ability to enjoy it. There are certainly games that I've played where I feel I don't necessarily have the ability to develop a strong strategy because of how complex the game is, but that doesn't prevent me from enjoying it. I still have fun with the game. And even, if I'm losing every game, I don't care. It's still probably a great game. It's got great mechanics. It's interesting. It's unique every time. The complexity adds to it, for me at least. So yeah, just don't judge games by how they look, even how they look on a table. Obviously not just the box on the shelf, but even once you set it up, don't be afraid of it. Give it a try. And especially if you're a newer player, some of the best games out there are rated slightly more complex. That's kind of just how it is. It's harder to drive a Ferrari than it is a Toyota, right? You're still going to have a better time with it once you get yourself over that initial hurdle of, okay, it's a more complex game. It's a bigger system. It's got more moving parts to it. There are more components to deal with. I have to keep more strategy in mind, but you're still probably going to have a good time with the game. Don't shy away from it just because it looks a little bit scary. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this little chat about board game complexity and why you should always give almost any board game a try. And I will see you guys in the next one. Have a good day.